In a small, quiet town, 90-year-old veteran Eleanor has lived a peaceful life, keeping to herself and enjoying the serenity of her old home. But her world is turned upside down when a gang of ruthless bikers, led by a man with a brutal reputation, rolls into town. They think she's an easy target, an elderly woman, alone and vulnerable. What they don't know is that Eleanor is not the woman she appears to be. When the bikers push her too far, she makes one phone call to her son, a Navy SEAL, and unleashes a chain of events that will bring their entire criminal empire to its knees. What follows will be a reckoning that no one saw coming. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. Eleanor sat on her front porch, the old rocking chair creaking with every gentle movement. Her hands, weathered with age, rested on her lap, and her eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the sun was beginning its slow descent behind the distant hills. The town of Pine Ridge was quiet, too quiet. The peaceful hum of life had been disrupted only by the occasional hum of a passing car or the distant sound of children playing. But for the most part, the days stretched out lazily, one blending into the next. Eleanor had seen a lot in her 90 years. She had lived through wars, heartache, and loss. She had buried her friends, her comrades, and even her husband, who had passed away peacefully in his sleep 5 years ago. The world around her had changed so much, and she was content to let it pass by while she enjoyed the small things in life. The soft breeze that ran through the trees, the chirping of the birds, the smell of fresh coffee brewing in her kitchen. But something had shifted recently, something Eleanor couldn't quite put her finger on. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense of unease that had been creeping into Pine Ridge like a storm on the horizon. She had heard whispers of trouble, a gang of bikers rolling into town making noise, causing disruptions. But Eleanor hadn't paid much attention. What did she care about a bunch of unruly bikers? She had lived through worse, much worse, and she wasn't afraid of a few men on motorcycles. It wasn't until one afternoon, when Eleanor was walking down the main street to pick up her mail, that she realized how wrong she had been to underestimate them. The Black Vultures, a gang notorious for their violent and criminal behavior, had rolled into town that very morning. At first, it seemed harmless enough. A few bikes parked outside the local diner, their engines revving loudly, their riders swaggering into the establishment like they owned the place. But as Eleanor walked past, she noticed something unsettling. The way the bikers looked at her as she passed by. The way their laughter had turned into a hushed silence. The way their leader, a towering man with tattoos covering his arms and a vicious scar running down his face, had stared at her, a smirk playing on his lips. It was a look that made Eleanor's skin crawl. She had seen that kind of arrogance before, the kind of arrogance that came from men who believed they could take whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. They thought she was just an old woman, nothing to fear, nothing to protect. But they didn't know who she was, and they didn't know what she was capable of. As Eleanor continued her walk home, her hand instinctively brushed the small pendant around her neck, a reminder of a time long ago when she had fought alongside brave men in foreign lands. It was a reminder that she wasn't just any old woman. She had lived through hell and survived. She wasn't afraid of anyone or anything, not even a group of vicious bikers. That night, Eleanor tried to put the encounter out of her mind, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the old house seemed to echo louder in the silence, and her mind kept drifting back to those bikers, their glares, their jeers. They had been looking for something. They hadn't just been passing through. They had been looking for trouble. The next day, she decided to visit the diner for a cup of coffee. She wasn't a regular, but she liked to sit at the counter and watch the world go by, exchanging small pleasantries with the locals. She had hoped that maybe things had calmed down, that the bikers had moved on. But when she walked into the diner, she saw them. The Black Vultures were still there, sitting at a corner booth, their eyes tracking her every movement. Eleanor's heart sank. She knew they weren't just watching her, they were waiting for her. She could feel it in the air, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. She had heard about these men. Their reputation preceded them. They weren't just a nuisance. They were a criminal empire running drugs, extorting businesses, and leaving a trail of destruction wherever they went. But Eleanor wasn't scared. She wasn't a woman to be intimidated by men who thought they were above the law. She had faced worse in her youth, men who thought they could push her around, and men who had learned very quickly that they had made a grave mistake. As she sat down at the counter and ordered her coffee, she felt their eyes on her. The leader, the man with the scar, was staring at her again, a grin spreading across his face as he leaned back in his seat. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the mug in front of her, and for the first time in years, she felt something that she hadn't in a long time: anger. These men were threatening her town. They were threatening her peace, and she wasn't about to let them get away with it. Eleanor stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and made her way toward the door. She could hear the leader call out to her from behind, his voice mocking. "Where do you think you're going, Grandma? We're just getting started." Eleanor didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew what she had to do. As she stepped outside into the warm sunlight, she pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking ever so slightly as she dialed a number she hadn't called in years. She had avoided this call for a long time, but now she had no choice. The phone rang twice before the voice on the other end answered. "Mom?" The voice was steady, calm, but there was a hint of concern underneath it. It was her son, her only son. "Jimmy," Eleanor's voice cracked slightly as she spoke. "I need your help." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the phone as her son's voice crackled through the line. She hadn't called him in years, not since he had joined the Navy SEALs. She had always tried to keep her distance, hoping that his dangerous career would stay far away from her quiet life. She wanted him safe, away from the violence, the chaos. But the world had changed, and Eleanor knew she couldn't handle the storm that was coming alone. "Mom? What's wrong?" Jimmy's voice was now filled with concern, the calm facade replaced by an edge that only a mother's voice could provoke. I'm in trouble, Jimmy," Eleanor said, her voice steady but a tremor creeping in. "There's a gang of bikers in town. They've been causing trouble, and I don't think they're leaving anytime soon." The words hung in the air for a moment, the weight of them settling between them like an unsaid understanding. Eleanor had never been the kind of person to ask for help, especially from her son, but she had no other choice now. These weren't just bikers, they were a criminal empire, one that would crush anything in their path if they weren't stopped. Jimmy's silence on the other end was enough to tell her he was processing the information, running through possibilities in his mind. She knew what he was thinking. He was trained for war, for taking down enemies much worse than a few criminals on motorcycles. But there was more to this than just the bikers. This was about protecting her, protecting the town. "Mom, I want you to stay inside and lock the doors. Don't go out. I'm coming. I'll be there as soon as I can," Jimmy said, his voice firm, with an edge of urgency that made Eleanor's heart race. "I don't want you involved, Jimmy," Eleanor said, her voice softening, but the edge of defiance still there. "This town doesn't need you to fight for it. You've got your life. I just need you to know what's happening. You don't get to make decisions for me, Mom," Jimmy shot back, the heat in his voice making it clear that he was already in motion. "I'm not leaving you to handle this on your own. I'll be there." Eleanor's throat tightened, and she struggled to keep her emotions in check. She had raised Jimmy to be strong, to fight for what was right, and she couldn't deny the fierce pride she felt in him. But she had always tried to protect him from the dangers of her past. She had never wanted him to be like the soldiers she once knew, warriors who could kill with a single shot, men who had seen the worst of humanity. "I'll be waiting for you," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly, but there was no room for doubt in her heart anymore. She knew he was coming. He would always come when she needed him. He was her son after all, and he would do anything to protect her. "Stay safe, Mom. I'm coming for you. I promise." The line went dead, and Eleanor lowered the phone slowly, staring at it for a long moment as if the weight of the call had not yet fully sunk in. She stood in the middle of her living room, surrounded by the quiet reminders of a life well lived, a life that had been peaceful, mostly for decades. But that peace was now shattered. The bikers weren't going to stop at a few petty threats. They wanted something bigger. They wanted to control the town, to take over everything, and they would stop at nothing to do it. Eleanor knew what needed to be done. She had been through far worse in her youth: wars, battles, moments of terror that would haunt most people for a lifetime. But she wasn't just going to wait for Jimmy to save her. She wasn't going to cower in fear while a gang of criminals roamed through her town. She had faced far greater enemies in her life, and she was still standing. For a moment, she allowed herself to remember who she used to be, the woman who had fought, who had made difficult decisions, and who had survived it all. The woman who had fought for her country, who had fought for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The woman who had trained with weapons, who had learned the art of survival in the harshest conditions. She wasn't just a 90-year-old woman waiting for her son to come to her rescue. She was a warrior, a woman who had lived through war and had lived to tell the tale. The doorbell rang, and Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She froze for a moment, her breath caught in her chest. Was it Jimmy already? No, it couldn't be. He was still on his way. But as she slowly moved toward the door, she heard the sound of boots on the porch and the unmistakable roar of motorcycle engines nearby. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. She couldn't afford to let fear take over. She took a deep breath and swung the door open, meeting the eyes of the bikers who stood on her doorstep. There were 5 of them this time, their leather jackets adorned with menacing symbols, their faces hard and unforgiving. The leader, tall, broad-shouldered, with a jagged scar running across his face, smiled as he saw her standing there unmoving. His eyes glinted with cruel amusement. Well, what do we have here?" he sneered. "The old lady thinks she can stop us, huh? You really think we're going to just leave?" Eleanor met his gaze with a defiance that sent a chill through him. She wasn't going to let these men intimidate her. Not now. Not ever. "You're going to leave," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "But if you don't, I'll make sure you regret it." The leader's grin faltered for a split second. He clearly hadn't expected the old woman to speak so boldly. But that wasn't what scared him. It was the calmness in her eyes, the confidence in her stance. Something about her didn't feel like a weak old lady. She felt dangerous. And that's when the phone rang again. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her back straight, her eyes never leaving the leader of the bikers. His grin faltered, and for the briefest moment, doubt flashed across his face. He had expected fear. He had expected an easy target. But Eleanor wasn't the frail, scared old woman he had hoped to find. She had lived a life filled with much more than simple survival. And now, at 90, she still had the heart of a fighter. The sound of a phone ringing broke the tense silence, the harsh buzz pulling her attention away from the bikers standing on her porch. Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't need to look at the caller ID to know who was on the other end. It was Jimmy. He was calling to check in to see if she was still safe. And even though the bikers stood right in front of her, the sound of her son's voice brought a strange sense of calm. "Excuse me," she said, her voice smooth and confident. She took a step back, still holding her ground, and picked up the phone, all the while keeping her eyes locked on the bikers. She didn't need to acknowledge them anymore. They were irrelevant in this moment. "Mom." Jimmy's voice came through loud and clear, filled with concern and a hint of urgency. "Are you okay?" "I'm on my way. I'll be there in—" "I'm fine, Jimmy," Eleanor interrupted, keeping her voice steady. "But I'm not going to be able to wait for you." "What do you mean?" Jimmy's voice tightened. "Mom, I told you to stay inside. You don't need to." "I need you to listen," Eleanor said, cutting him off once again, her tone firm. The bikers, they're here. They've been harassing me, and now they've come to make a point. I'm not going to sit here waiting for them to do whatever they want." Eleanor's eyes flicked to the bikers standing at the edge of her porch, their postures still filled with a false sense of superiority. She could feel their eyes boring into her back as they watched her speak to her son. "Mom, I need you to stay inside and lock the doors. I'll be there in no time. Just stay calm." "I'm calm, Jimmy," she said, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of her lips as she glanced over at the bikers. "But we don't have the luxury of waiting anymore." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line as Jimmy processed her words. He was a Navy SEAL, trained for moments like these, moments of intensity and danger. But even he had never expected his mother to be the one calling for help. Not like this. She had never been the helpless, dependent kind of person, and that had made her the woman she was. "Mom, what are you saying?" His voice was full of concern, but Eleanor could hear the edge of determination underneath. He knew she wasn't calling for help because she couldn't handle the situation. She was calling because she was ready to face it head-on. And he knew what that meant. "I'm saying," she said, her voice lowering to a deadly calm, "that if they don't leave soon, they'll regret it." The bikers exchanged glances. Eleanor could hear the leader's scoff behind her, but she didn't turn around. She didn't need to. They were testing her now, seeing just how far they could push her. And Eleanor knew the moment they made the mistake of underestimating her, that's when they would lose. "I'll be there soon, Mom. Just hang tight. Don't do anything reckless." Jimmy's voice was tinged with worry, but she could hear the determination in his words. "I won't, Jimmy, but I've spent my life fighting battles. I'm not backing down now," Eleanor replied, her voice steady and unwavering. "These men have no idea who they're messing with." She hung up the phone, the finality of her decision settling into her chest. The bikers were still standing there, still unsure of what to make of her. The leader had a sneer on his face, but it wasn't the same arrogant, cocky smile he had worn when he first walked onto her porch. It was more of a mask, a sign that he wasn't quite sure what to expect. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the leader growled, his voice thick with menace. "You don't know who you're dealing with, old woman." Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes unflinching. "I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly how this is going to end." The leader's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he wasn't sure how to handle this unexpected resistance. And that hesitation, that doubt, was all Eleanor needed. She stepped back into her house, closing the door softly behind her, and locked it with a firm click. But she wasn't going to hide in the shadows. She wasn't afraid of what these bikers might do. She had survived much worse in her past, and she wasn't going to let them take control now. She moved through the house with practiced ease, making her way to the basement, where she kept the items she had never let go of. As her fingers brushed the cold metal of her old service revolver, she felt the rush of memories flood her mind. The gun had been with her through so many battles, so many fights for survival. It had saved her life more times than she could count, and it would do so again tonight. With a steady hand, Eleanor checked the ammunition, loading the revolver with the precision of someone who had been trained to use it. She wasn't just an old woman. She wasn't just a target for these bikers. She was a veteran, a woman who had fought for her country and had come out stronger for it. Eleanor knew what had to be done, and when her son arrived, he would find her ready, not cowering behind the door, but standing strong, fighting back the darkness that threatened to swallow her town. The rumble of the motorcycles grew louder as Eleanor stood by the basement door, her revolver now secure in her hand. She didn't need to look out the window to know they were coming for her. The sound of their engines was unmistakable. The black vultures had returned, their bikes growling as they approached, their tires screeching against the dirt road. She could feel the vibrations in her bones, the unsettling hum of their presence in the air. Eleanor wasn't afraid. She couldn't afford to be. The truth was, she had been through far worse. She had been through wars, violence, and loss. She had seen the worst that humanity had to offer and had survived, stronger and sharper for it. This was just another battle, one that she would win. She moved quickly through the house, checking every window and locking every door, her mind sharp, her body moving with the confidence of someone who had fought many battles before. The bikers thought they could intimidate her. They thought they could break her. But they were wrong. They didn't know who they were dealing with. The leader, the one who had been so cocky before, was the first to reach her porch. She could hear his footsteps on the wooden steps, heavy and deliberate. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't look toward the door. Instead, she turned her attention to the revolver in her hand, checking the rounds, making sure everything was in place. She had been ready for this moment for a long time. Now it was time to face it head-on. The doorbell rang, its shrill sound cutting through the air like a warning. Eleanor took a deep breath and walked toward the front door, her heart steady, her mind focused. She didn't open it immediately. Instead, she stood on the other side, listening to the muffled voices of the bikers as they gathered outside. She could hear their laughter, the way they taunted her, talked down to her like she was nothing. Their words meant nothing. Eleanor knew their kind. She had dealt with men like them in her youth, men who thought they could take what they wanted, when they wanted, without fear of consequence. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Finally, she opened the door, her hand steady on the knob. The leader was standing there, his grin wide, his eyes filled with malice. "You ready to apologize yet, Grandma?" he sneered, taking a step closer. "You've got one last chance to make this easy on yourself." Eleanor's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. She could feel his arrogance, his belief that he had all the power, but she wasn't intimidated. She wasn't afraid. "No," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "I'm not going to apologize. But you're going to leave. Now." The leader's smirk faltered for a brief second, but he recovered quickly, his anger flaring. "You think you can tell me what to do, old woman?" Eleanor didn't respond. Instead, she reached for the revolver hidden beneath her apron, her movements slow and deliberate. She drew the weapon smoothly, pointing it straight at the leader's chest. The bikers behind him froze, their eyes widening as they realized just how serious she was. The leader's grin disappeared, replaced by a look of shock and disbelief. "What the hell?" "You're going to leave," Eleanor repeated, her voice low and steady. "You've already made your point. Now, get out." For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the air thick with tension. The leader's eyes darted from Eleanor's gun to the men behind him. He could see that she wasn't bluffing. He had made a grave mistake by underestimating her. But he wasn't ready to admit defeat. "You think you're going to scare us off with an old gun?" he sneered, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "I don't need to scare you," Eleanor said, her grip on the revolver never wavering. "I just need to make sure you understand that this town is not yours to take." The bikers shifted nervously, glancing at each other, their bravado starting to crumble. They had come for an easy target, expecting an old woman to cower before them. But what they found was something they hadn't counted on. A woman with the heart of a warrior, someone who had faced far worse in her life. For a moment, the leader's gaze hardened, and he seemed to make a decision. With a quick motion, he reached for his own weapon, pulling it from his waistband. But before he could even raise it, Eleanor's revolver fired, the sharp crack of the shot ringing through the quiet street. The leader staggered back, his hand flying to his chest, where the bullet had struck. His eyes widened in shock as he looked down at the blood soaking through his shirt. "You should have left," Eleanor said, her voice calm, her hand steady as she lowered the gun. The bikers stood frozen, staring at the leader, who was now on the ground, gasping for breath. The violence in the air was palpable, and the sound of their leader's pain seemed to hang in the balance. "Anyone else want to test me?" Eleanor's voice cut through the silence like a knife. She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. She had already proven everything they needed to know. The bikers stood motionless, the realization dawning on them that this wasn't a fight they could win. The leader, groaning on the ground, had been the loudest, the most arrogant. But Eleanor had just neutralized the threat. The rest of them were nothing more than shadows now, waiting for their turn to leave. Without another word, they began to retreat, their eyes wide with fear. They hadn't expected a woman like Eleanor. They hadn't expected her to be as deadly as the stories they had heard about her. As they climbed onto their bikes and roared away, Eleanor remained standing on her porch, her revolver still in her hand. The battle was over for now, but she knew this wasn't the last time they would come for her. The sound of a motorcycle engine broke the silence once again, but this time, it wasn't the black vultures returning. It was Jimmy, her son. Eleanor's grip on the revolver loosened, her heart swelling with pride as she heard the unmistakable hum of his bike getting closer. She knew he was coming, and with him, the storm that would bring their empire to its knees. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her grip on the revolver loosening as the sound of the approaching motorcycle grew louder. Her pulse quickened. She didn't know why, but hearing Jimmy's bike brought an overwhelming rush of relief. She had done what she could to protect her home, but she knew this fight was far from over. The black vultures wouldn't give up so easily, and neither would McCall. Her mind was already turning, working through the next steps. She couldn't just sit here, waiting for the storm to come. She needed to be ready for the fight ahead. The bike roared to a stop outside her porch, and a moment later, Jimmy's tall, broad figure appeared, stepping off his motorcycle with practiced ease. His military uniform, although slightly worn from the ride, was a reminder of who he was, who he had become. He was no longer the young boy she had raised. He was a Navy SEAL, a warrior with the skills to face any danger head-on. "Mom." Jimmy's voice was filled with concern as he moved quickly toward her, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. "Are you okay?" Eleanor looked up at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She had always been proud of him, proud of the man he had become. But today, she wasn't just his mother. Today, she was his equal. She had faced the black vultures alone, and she had survived. She wasn't going to back down now. "I'm fine, Jimmy," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm not going to wait for them to come back. I need you to listen." Jimmy's brow furrowed as he stepped closer, his eyes now scanning the porch, taking in the scene. His eyes darted to the fallen leader of the bikers, still gasping for air on the ground. He understood immediately what had happened. "You shot him?" he asked, the disbelief clear in his voice. Mom, you didn't." "I had no choice," Eleanor interrupted, her tone calm but filled with authority. "They pushed me too far. They won't stop, Jimmy. They came here to take over. I can't let that happen. Not in my town." Jimmy's eyes softened as he took a step closer to her. He had seen his mother face many battles in her time, but this was different. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about protecting the people she loved, the place she had spent her entire life building. He reached out, pulling her into a tight hug, his strong arms wrapping around her frail frame. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he whispered. "But you didn't have to do this alone. I'm here now. We'll take care of it together." Eleanor held him tightly for a moment, feeling the weight of his presence beside her. She had always feared that she might have to call him back into a fight like this, but now that he was here, she couldn't deny the relief she felt. He was her son, and together they would bring this empire down. "Jimmy," she said, pulling away, her voice now filled with urgency. "This isn't just about the black vultures anymore. It's bigger than them. The leader of that gang? He's just a pawn. They're working for someone much more dangerous." Jimmy's gaze hardened as he absorbed her words. "McCall," he said, his voice low, filled with recognition. Eleanor nodded. "That's right. Jack McCall. He's been running this town for months now, pulling the strings, getting his men in place. These bikers are just the beginning. He's got bigger plans for Pine Ridge." And if we don't stop him now, he'll take everything we've worked for." Jimmy's eyes darkened, the weight of her words settling in. He had heard of Jack McCall, a man so ruthless that even the most hardened criminals were afraid of him. McCall had built an empire based on fear, extortion, and violence. No one was safe from him, not even Pine Ridge. "We need to act fast," Jimmy said, his voice a mixture of determination and urgency. "McCall's not going to stop. But we've got an advantage. We know his plan. We know he's vulnerable." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes steady. "I'm not afraid of McCall or his empire. But we can't do this alone. We need help. We need people who are willing to fight with us, to stand up against him." Jimmy nodded. "I know people. People who owe me favors. But we need to move quickly. McCall's already planning his next move. We can't wait around." Eleanor turned toward the house, her gaze sweeping across the familiar walls that had once been filled with warmth and safety. Now, they were filled with the knowledge that the town was under threat. That was the reality she had to face, and she wasn't going to back down. "Not now. We'll fight for Pine Ridge," she said, her voice strong, resolute. "We'll make McCall wish he never set foot here." Jimmy's eyes shone with pride as he gave her a quick nod. "I've got your back, Mom. Always." The two of them stood together for a moment, the weight of the decision they had made settling in. They were about to face a dangerous, corrupt criminal empire, one that had taken root in their town. But Eleanor knew they weren't alone. She had her son by her side, and together, they would bring Jack McCall's empire crashing down. The battle had just begun. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the town of Pine Ridge as Eleanor and Jimmy stood on the porch, discussing their next move. The street was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that came right before a storm. It felt like the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable conflict that was about to unfold. But Eleanor knew that if she was going to protect Pine Ridge, she couldn't just wait around for trouble to show up at her door. She had to take the fight to them. "All right, Mom," Jimmy said, pulling a notepad from his jacket pocket. "We'll need to get to work quickly. First, we need intel. We need to know exactly where McCall's men are holed up, how many of them there are, and where they're operating from. We can't go in blind." Eleanor nodded, her mind already working through the logistics. She had spent years quietly watching the town, listening to the whispers of the locals, and she knew there were people who were willing to help, people who were tired of living in fear. It was time to bring them together. "I've got a few ideas," she said. "There's a lot of talk among the locals. Some of the farmers, the business owners, they've seen things, heard things. We just need to get them talking. If they think we can win, they'll help us." Jimmy looked at her with a hint of surprise, impressed by her calm demeanor and strategic thinking. "I didn't realize you had such a network in town." Eleanor smiled, a small, knowing grin that spoke volumes. "I may be old, Jimmy, but I've been around long enough to know that people talk. If we push the right buttons, we can get them to stand up." She paused, then added, "I've seen enough to know that McCall's got people in the town council. I suspect he's been using his influence to get things done. We need to get to them before they can rally more of their men." Jimmy's face hardened at the mention of McCall's corruption. "I'll handle the military tactics, but you're right. We need to make sure we're not walking into a trap. If we start by cutting off McCall's communication, it'll give us the upper hand." Eleanor walked toward the front door, pausing just before she stepped inside. She turned back to Jimmy, her eyes glinting with a quiet determination. "We'll start with the people who can help us. We need to bring them together, make them understand that this is about more than just us. It's about protecting Pine Ridge." Jimmy stepped forward, his face serious, but with a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I'll round up the people we need, Mom. You're right. This isn't just about taking down a few thugs. This is about saving a town." Over the next few hours, the two of them moved quickly, working side by side to build a resistance. Jimmy began reaching out to some of his contacts from the military, securing the help of a few local veterans who had served with him in the past. They were tough men and women hardened by experience, but there was something different about the way they spoke now. This wasn't a war overseas. This was home, and they would fight to the death for it. Meanwhile, Eleanor went door to door, speaking with the townsfolk, reminding them of their strength, their history, and the community they had built together. She spoke to farmers, shopkeepers, and old friends, convincing them that now was the time to stand up and fight back. It wasn't easy. Many of them were scared, unsure if they could really take on McCall and his empire. But Eleanor's voice, strong and unyielding, gave them the courage they needed. At the end of the night, Eleanor and Jimmy met back at the house, the weight of the day's work settling in. "We've got a solid team," Jimmy said, pulling out a map and spreading it across the kitchen table. "I've made contact with a few people who can get us information about McCall's operations. We just need to be careful. He's not going to sit back and wait for us to come to him." Eleanor nodded, taking a seat at the table beside him. She studied the map, her eyes tracing the familiar streets of Pine Ridge. This town, this quiet little place, had been the backdrop to so much of her life. She had seen the best and worst of it. But now, she would fight to ensure that it would not fall into the hands of a criminal empire. "We'll hit them where it hurts," Eleanor said, her voice low and determined. "We'll cut off McCall's supply lines, take out his men one by one, and make sure he knows that Pine Ridge is off limits." Jimmy's eyes narrowed as he studied the map, his fingers tapping on the table. "We'll need to do this smart. We can't afford to make any mistakes." Eleanor stood, her hand on the table, her voice steady. "There's no room for mistakes anymore. We've already given McCall a warning. He won't back off. But we will." The next morning, Eleanor and Jimmy gathered their small army of local veterans, farmers, and townsfolk who had volunteered to stand up against McCall and his empire. They gathered in the old church, its pews now filled with people who had once lived in fear, but were now ready to take action. Eleanor stood at the front, her heart swelling with pride as she looked around at the faces of the people she had spent her life protecting. These were the ones who had helped her build this town, who had fought for their families and their land. And now they were going to fight for each other. "You know why we're here," Eleanor began, her voice carrying through the room, her eyes meeting each person's gaze. "We're here because this town is ours. We built it. We fought for it. And we're not going to let anyone take it away from us." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Then, one by one, the people in the room stood up, nodding, their faces filled with resolve. "We fight together," one of the veterans said, his voice steady. "For Pine Ridge. For our families." Eleanor nodded, a fierce smile crossing her face. "Together, we bring McCall's empire down." The town of Pine Ridge had shifted. No longer was it the quiet, peaceful town that people came to for refuge. It had become something more, something dangerous for the Black Vultures and Jack McCall. Eleanor and Jimmy had managed to assemble a team, a patchwork group of veterans, farmers, and local townsfolk who were no longer willing to cower in fear. Now, they had a plan, and that plan started with hitting McCall's supply lines. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the town as the resistance met in the old church. The plans had been laid out. Disrupt McCall's operations without alerting his full force. Strike hard, fast, and retreat before they could mount a counterattack. Jimmy stood at the front of the church, a map of Pine Ridge stretched out before him. His eyes flicked over the routes they would take, calculating every possibility. His mind worked like a machine, every detail falling into place as he analyzed the way McCall's men moved and where their resources were stored. "We've got two primary targets tonight," Jimmy said, his voice low but commanding. "The first is McCall's weapon stash. If we take out his weapons, we cripple his ability to fight back. The second is his cash flow. If we cut off his money, we starve his empire." Eleanor stood to the side, listening intently. She wasn't as familiar with the military tactics, but she trusted Jimmy's judgment. She could see it in his eyes, the focus, the determination. He wasn't just here for her. He was here for the town. He would do anything to make sure Pine Ridge was safe again. "We'll split into 2 teams," Jimmy continued, pointing to the map on the table. "One team will handle the weapons. We'll move in fast, take what we can, and set the rest on fire. The second team will hit the money. We'll raid the vaults, take the cash, and leave nothing behind. We don't want McCall to have anything left to rebuild with." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the plan settling in. Everyone understood what they were about to do. They understood the risk. But they also understood that this was their only chance to take down McCall's empire before it could grow any stronger. Eleanor looked around at the faces in the room, her neighbors, her friends, the people who had trusted her to lead them. They had been through hard times, but now they were ready to fight. "Remember," she said, her voice steady but filled with the conviction she had carried all her life, "this isn't just about us. It's about Pine Ridge. It's about showing McCall that we're not afraid to fight back. If we stand together, we can take him down. But we have to move fast. We have to be smart." The group nodded in agreement, the weight of her words ringing true. They were ready. For the first time in years, they were ready to fight for their town. The night was dark when they finally set out. Jimmy, Eleanor, and the rest of the team moved silently through the streets, their faces grim, their hearts steady. The night air was cool, and the moon hung low, casting pale light over the town. Pine Ridge was quiet, too quiet, as the resistance moved like shadows, blending into the dark. The first team, led by one of the veterans, headed toward the warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was heavily guarded, but they knew McCall's men weren't expecting an attack tonight. They were confident, complacent in their belief that they controlled the town. And that was the mistake they were about to make. Jimmy and Eleanor led the second team toward the town's main street, where McCall's money was hidden in an old bank vault. It was a well-guarded spot, but they knew McCall had grown too confident. He had underestimated the town, and now that would be his downfall. As they approached the bank, Eleanor's heart raced. She had been in tight situations before, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about taking back control. This was her chance to show McCall that Pine Ridge was not for the taking. Eleanor motioned for the team to spread out, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of trouble. The streets were still, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the gravel. They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, slipping past the few guards that McCall had left behind. When they reached the bank, they quickly disabled the security system and forced the door open. Inside, the vault was locked, but Jimmy had already anticipated this. He had come prepared, carrying the tools necessary to crack it open. As he worked, Eleanor stood guard, her senses sharp, her revolver ready. The tension in the air was thick. They didn't have much time before McCall's men realized they had been hit. Jimmy's fingers worked quickly, his years of training evident in the way he moved. The lock clicked, and the vault door swung open with a heavy groan. Inside, stacks of cash sat neatly organized, waiting to be taken. Jimmy and the team quickly began gathering the money, shoving it into bags as fast as they could. But even as they worked, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air felt charged, like a storm was about to break. "Move quickly," she whispered, her voice urgent. "We don't have much time." Just as they finished loading the bags, the sound of motorcycles reached their ears. The black vultures were coming. "We're out of time," Jimmy said, his voice grim. "Let's go." The team moved swiftly, racing out of the bank and into the shadows. But as they made their way toward the exit, a figure stepped out of the alleyway in front of them. It was one of McCall's men, his face twisted in a snarl as he raised his weapon. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She fired first, the gunshot ringing through the night, and the man fell to the ground, his weapon clattering beside him. "Go, go, go!" Jimmy shouted, urging the team forward. They sprinted down the alley, their hearts pounding as the sound of motorcycles grew louder behind them. They had made it this far, But they weren't out of danger yet. McCall's men were closing in. But Eleanor wasn't afraid. She had faced worse before, and she knew what needed to be done. This wasn't just about stealing from McCall. This was about sending a message. The sound of engines roared in the distance, growing louder as McCall's men closed in on the resistance. Eleanor's heart raced, but her mind was clear. She had been through many battles in her life, fought wars, survived against all odds, but this felt different. This was personal. This wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming her town, her peace, and showing McCall that Pine Ridge wouldn't bow to him. "We've got to move faster," Jimmy shouted, his voice urgent, the gravity of the situation pressing on them. He was running beside her, the bag of cash still slung over his shoulder, his face set in determination. The rest of the team was behind them, hustling down the alley toward the back streets of Pine Ridge. They couldn't let McCall's men catch up to them. They couldn't afford to be caught. Eleanor glanced over her shoulder, catching a glimpse of the headlights coming around the corner. The bikers were closing in. She couldn't let them take control now. Not after everything they had worked for. "We need to split up," Eleanor said, her voice sharp as she made the decision quickly. "You and the team head to the old barn on the outskirts. I'll cover the back. I'll draw them off." Jimmy's eyes widened, but Eleanor didn't wait for him to protest. She had made up her mind. "Mom, no." Jimmy grabbed her arm, pulling her to a stop. "You can't take them on by yourself. We need to stay together." "I'm not staying hidden, Jimmy," Eleanor said, her voice calm but filled with resolve. "You take the team and get to safety. I'll be right behind you." There was no room for argument in her voice. This was her town, and she wasn't going to let McCall's men tear it apart. Not now. With one last look at her son, Eleanor broke away from the group and sprinted down a side street, the bag of money in hand. She didn't have the luxury of time, and she didn't have the luxury of fear. Her mind was focused, calculating the best way to draw McCall's men away from the others. She wasn't just running away. She was setting a trap. She knew the town better than anyone, and she would use every advantage she had. Behind her, the sound of motorcycles grew louder, but Eleanor didn't falter. She moved with purpose, staying low, staying fast. As she neared the town square, she ducked into an alley and waited. She could hear the rumble of the bikes approaching, the heavy sound of their engines vibrating through the air. Eleanor didn't take her eyes off the street ahead. She knew this town like the back of her hand. She knew where every alley, every building, every shadow could provide cover. When McCall's men came through, she would have them right where she wanted them. The first biker appeared, his headlights blinding as he tore through the alley. Eleanor took a deep breath and stepped out from the shadows, her revolver raised and ready. The biker didn't see her until it was too late. She fired once, the shot ringing out through the empty streets, and the biker's body went limp, falling off his bike with a thud. The rest of the gang wasn't far behind, and they quickly realized they were being ambushed. They revved their engines, trying to maneuver, but Eleanor was already on the move, weaving through the narrow streets and leading them toward the trap she had set. She wasn't trying to kill them all, just take out enough of them to give Jimmy and the rest of the team the chance to escape. She fired again, and another biker went down. The others began to scatter, their plan of pursuit quickly unraveling as Eleanor weaved through the town with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime in the shadows. But just as she was about to turn down another alley, a shot rang out from the darkness, and Eleanor felt a sharp pain in her side. She stumbled, but she didn't fall. She couldn't. Not now. She turned, her gun aimed and ready, but the shooter was already retreating into the shadows. The pain was searing, but Eleanor gritted her teeth and pressed on, determined to finish what she had started. Meanwhile, Jimmy and the rest of the resistance had made it to the old barn on the outskirts of town. They had narrowly avoided McCall's men, but they knew it was only a matter of time before the bikers would figure out they had been outsmarted. "Where's Mom?" one of the veterans asked, his voice filled with concern. "She's drawing them away," Jimmy said, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. "She'll be all right. We need to stick to the plan." But Jimmy couldn't shake the worry gnawing at him. He knew his mother. He knew she was tough, but this was too dangerous. He couldn't lose her now, not after everything. "We can't stay here for long," Jimmy added, his voice urgent. "We've got the cash, but McCall's men are still out there. They'll come for us." The team nodded in agreement. They had to move fast. Jimmy quickly divided the money among the group, making sure everyone had their share. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make McCall think twice about the town. It was a message. "We need to regroup," Jimmy said. "We can't let them catch us while we're scattered." As they prepared to leave the barn and head deeper into the forest for cover, Jimmy's phone buzzed in his pocket. He quickly pulled it out, seeing his mother's name flash across the screen. "Mom," he answered, his voice tight with concern. There was a long pause before Eleanor's voice came through, low and strained. "Jimmy," she took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. "I'm all right, but we need to hurry. McCall's men are on their way. I've led them away, but I'm injured. I can't keep them off for much longer." Jimmy's heart dropped into his stomach. "Where are you?" "We're coming to you, Mom. Hold on." "I'll be fine," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "But you have to finish this. Don't let them take Pine Ridge. Don't let McCall win." The line went dead. The moment the line went dead, Jimmy felt the weight of the situation settle over him like a thick, suffocating fog. His mother, the woman who had taught him to stand strong in the face of any adversity, had been injured. And now, she was alone in the middle of a town that was swarming with McCall's men. He couldn't let her face this alone. He couldn't lose her. "Get ready," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "We're going after her." The team, already on high alert, jumped into action. The barn was no longer safe. McCall's men were closing in on it, and it was only a matter of time before they found them. Jimmy's mind raced, processing every detail. His military training kicked in, and in an instant, his tactical mind was working through the best way to extract his mother and neutralize the threat. "All right," he said, glancing around at his team. "We move fast. We'll circle back into town, keep low, and find her. We get her out, and we don't stop until we're clear of McCall's men." His voice was a steady command, but inside, his heart was pounding. This wasn't just a mission. This wasn't just another job. This was his mother, and he wasn't about to let anything happen to her. Not while he had the power to do something about it. The team nodded, preparing to move out. They quickly gathered their gear and headed toward the back exit of the barn, staying out of sight. They had to move fast and make sure they weren't spotted. The woods surrounding Pine Ridge provided some cover, but it wouldn't last long. McCall's men were skilled trackers, and Jimmy knew they would be hunting them. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat on the ground behind a stack of crates in an abandoned shed just outside of town. Her side burned with pain, the bullet wound a constant reminder of how close things had gotten. She had stopped the bleeding for now, using the fabric from her old jacket to bind the wound, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. She could feel her energy draining. Her body was screaming for rest, but she couldn't give in. Not yet. The bikers were still out there, their engines a constant hum in the distance. Eleanor's mind was sharp despite the pain, calculating her next move. She knew she couldn't stay in the shed for long. McCall's men would eventually come looking for her. She had bought Jimmy and the rest of the team time, but that was all she had done. The real battle was still ahead. Her thoughts flickered to her son. She knew he would be coming for her. He wouldn't let anything happen to her. But Eleanor wasn't about to wait around for a rescue. She had fought battles alone before, and she would do it again if necessary. But this time, she wasn't alone, and that gave her hope. The sound of a motorcycle engine grew louder, snapping her out of her thoughts. She tensed, instinctively reaching for her revolver. Her fingers gripped the cold metal tightly, despite the pain in her side. The engine came closer and closer until it stopped right outside the shed. Eleanor held her breath, waiting. She didn't have to wonder who it was. McCall's men weren't the quiet type. They were the kind of men who didn't care about being heard, the kind who reveled in their power. The motorcycle's engine cut off with a roar, and Eleanor knew she had mere moments before the door would be forced open. Just as the door creaked, she fired. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession, hitting the man in the chest and sending him crashing to the ground before he could even react. The sound of the shots echoed in the still night, but Eleanor didn't hesitate. She scrambled to her feet, the pain in her side flaring up, but she ignored it, focusing only on moving. She had to get out of the shed and back into the shadows before more bikers arrived. She made it to the edge of the woods, but as she moved deeper into the cover of the trees, she realized something. She wasn't alone anymore. Jimmy and his team were closing in on her location. The moment he heard the shots, he knew Eleanor had made a move. He motioned for the team to speed up, his heart hammering in his chest as he pushed them forward, guiding them through the underbrush toward the sound of the gunfire. "Mom!" he shouted as he ran, his voice a mixture of urgency and relief. The path ahead was dark, and the trees seemed to close in on them as they made their way through the forest. But Jimmy knew this land like the back of his hand, and he was determined to reach his mother before McCall's men did. They reached the edge of the forest and could see the faint outline of Eleanor ahead, moving with the kind of speed and precision that reminded him of the warrior she had once been. She was already several steps ahead, but she slowed when she heard his voice. She turned, her face lit by the moonlight, and Jimmy could see the exhaustion, the pain, but also the unmistakable fire in her eyes. "I'm fine," Eleanor said, her voice steady, but the exhaustion was clear. "Get the rest of the team out. I'll cover you." Jimmy didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm gently, but firmly, pulling her along with him as he turned back toward the woods, signaling to the rest of the team to follow. They moved quickly, taking the back roads toward the edge of Pine Ridge. They needed to get out, and they needed to do it fast. McCall's men were closing in. "Mom, I'm not letting you out of my sight again," Jimmy said, his voice full of determination. Eleanor glanced over at him, a small smile on her lips. "I know you won't." The tension in the air felt heavier than ever as Eleanor and Jimmy led the group deeper into the woods. The cold night wrapped around them like a shroud, but it was the growing realization that McCall's men were closing in that kept everyone on edge. The team was moving as fast as possible, but Eleanor knew they were running out of time. The longer they stayed in the open, the more vulnerable they became. They reached the edge of the woods, where a small creek ran, its water running cold and clear beneath the moonlight. They took cover behind the trees, out of sight, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. "We need to move," Jimmy said, his voice low but urgent. He had already spotted a series of old abandoned cabins in the distance, places they could use as temporary shelter to regroup. "McCall's men are still out there. If we don't get to safety soon, we're sitting ducks." Eleanor nodded, her sharp eyes scanning the tree line. "We'll head for the cabins. Stay low. Stay quiet." The team moved swiftly, covering the distance to the cabins in silence, each step deliberate and cautious. As they reached the first of the old, dilapidated buildings, they stopped to catch their breath, leaning against the walls for a moment. The sound of distant motorcycles still echoed through the air, but the bikers hadn't seen them yet. Eleanor's mind was calculating. She knew McCall would be relentless. He wouldn't stop hunting until he had them all. They huddled in the shadow of the cabin, out of sight from the main road. Jimmy's face was filled with worry, but Eleanor's was unwavering. She had trained him for this, taught him to think in moments of crisis. Now, she needed to remind him that they had an advantage. They weren't just a group of civilians. They had knowledge, they had resources, and they had something McCall's men would never understand. They had the will to fight for what was theirs. "We're not just defending," Eleanor said, her voice strong and steady. We're going to take this fight to McCall. We've got the cash. We've got the weapons. Now, we make sure he knows this town isn't his to take." Jimmy met her eyes, his expression hardening with resolve. "We're going to hit them back, aren't we?" "Exactly," Eleanor said, a fierce grin breaking across her face. "We're going to hit them hard, and we're going to hit them fast." They spent the next few hours in the cabins, laying out their plans. The team gathered around a makeshift map of the town, tracing McCall's known hideouts, supply caches, and points of interest. Jimmy had gotten information from some of his contacts in the military, and it was clear that McCall's men were disorganized. They were used to intimidation, not a town rising up against them. "We've got one chance to hit them before they can regroup," Jimmy said, his finger tracing the map as he spoke. "We target McCall's main hideout. We take it down, disrupt his operations, and we make sure he knows we're coming for him." Eleanor nodded. "We need to hit fast. No warning. Just strike when they least expect it." The next morning, they gathered the team and prepared to move out. Eleanor, Jimmy, and the others had worked through every detail, and now it was time to put the plan into action. They loaded up the equipment, rifles, explosives, and anything else they could carry, and headed toward the heart of McCall's operation. The morning was still early, and the town was quiet, but beneath the surface, tension was thick. Eleanor had always known that it wasn't just the bikers they had to worry about. McCall had eyes everywhere, and the closer they got to his hideout, the more likely they were to run into trouble. But Eleanor wasn't worried. She was ready. They moved through the streets, staying low, blending in with the shadows. The town was still unfamiliar with this level of resistance, and they would have to use that to their advantage. As they approached McCall's hideout, Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she kept her focus sharp. The town had been on the brink for too long, and now it was time to fight back. When they reached the hideout, the plan went into motion. Jimmy and the team moved in first, setting up explosives around the perimeter. Eleanor stayed behind with a small group, keeping watch. Her heart raced as she scanned the area. They couldn't afford any mistakes. This was the moment that would determine everything. The timer on the explosives was set, and the countdown began. "Move!" Jimmy's voice came over the radio, steady and calm. "It's time." As the team split off to take their designated positions, Eleanor found herself standing with her back to the wall of a nearby building, her revolver in hand, waiting for the inevitable chaos. The bikers inside McCall's hideout wouldn't know what hit them. They would be caught completely off guard, and that was exactly how they needed it to be. The first explosion rang out, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The shockwave reverberated through the air, and the sound of chaos erupted from within the hideout. Eleanor's pulse raced, but she remained focused, her hand steady on the grip of her revolver. The fight had begun. As McCall's men poured out of the building, scrambling in confusion and panic, Eleanor and her team moved in, taking them down one by one. There was no time for hesitation. They fought with precision, making sure every shot counted. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps, but she didn't slow down. She moved with a purpose, her eyes sharp, her instincts honed from a lifetime of survival. The bikers didn't stand a chance. McCall had underestimated Pine Ridge, and now his empire was crumbling before him. The sound of motorcycles grew louder in the distance, but it was too late. The resistance had already dealt McCall's men a crippling blow. The bikers were scattered, their numbers thinned, and the town was finally fighting back. Eleanor felt the rush of adrenaline course through her veins. This wasn't just about survival. This was about victory. And as the last of McCall's men retreated into the woods, Eleanor stood tall, her chest rising and falling with the weight of the battle they had just won. "We've done it," Jimmy said, his voice filled with awe as he walked up beside her. Eleanor looked around at the wreckage, the chaos of battle slowly giving way to a new sense of hope. They had struck the first blow against McCall's empire. But this fight wasn't over. Not yet. Not yet, Eleanor said, her voice firm. This is just the beginning. The aftermath of the attack was both a victory and a reminder that the war for Pine Ridge was far from over. Eleanor stood in the middle of the street, her hand still gripping the revolver, though the threat had passed. The explosions had left a jagged hole in the center of McCall's operations, but it was only one strike. She knew the enemy would regroup. They always did. Jimmy, sweat dripping down his forehead, approached her, his eyes scanning the area as he walked. The town had changed in a matter of hours. Once, Pine Ridge had been a quiet, unsuspecting place, a haven for people who wanted peace. Now, it had become a battleground, a place where an empire was collapsing under the weight of its own greed and corruption. "We've made a dent," Jimmy said, looking around at the town's destroyed streets, the signs of battle visible everywhere. "But McCall's not done yet." "No," Eleanor agreed, her voice low but unwavering. "This is just the beginning. McCall will come back, and when he does, we'll be ready for him." They stood there for a moment, the sound of distant footsteps signaling the arrival of the rest of their team. Everyone had done their part. The resistance was starting to form, but the true battle was still ahead. McCall was a man used to power, used to getting what he wanted, and now they had made him an enemy. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Jimmy pulled out a map of the town, spread it out in front of them, and studied it with concentration. "We know McCall's men have a few safe houses around here, but we've hit their main supply, and that's going to shake him. He'll have to regroup, and that gives us time to figure out his next move." Eleanor nodded, eyes narrowing as she studied the map. "We take out the safe houses. We hit him where it hurts, and we don't let up. We make sure he knows that this town isn't his to take." She looked over at the small group of locals who had gathered. Farmers, shopkeepers, veterans, and even a few old friends from the past. People who had once kept their heads down but were now standing alongside her and her son. Each of them carried a quiet resolve, their faces hardening as they realized the fight had only just begun. "We'll need to strike fast," Eleanor said, raising her voice so the group could hear. "McCall's men will be looking for us. They'll regroup, and when they do, they'll come harder than ever. We have to be ready." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. The people of Pine Ridge were tired of living in fear. They had been pushed for too long, and now they were fighting for something more than survival. They were fighting for their town. "We've already shown them we're not afraid," Jimmy added, looking at each of them. "But now it's time to show McCall that he's not welcome here. We take out his operations one by one. We hit them hard, hit them fast, and make sure they know Pine Ridge belongs to us." There was a murmur of agreement among the group. Some nodded, others exchanged determined glances. The mood had shifted. They weren't just defending anymore. They were taking the fight to McCall's doorstep. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Jimmy and Eleanor worked tirelessly to track down the Black Vulture's remaining safe houses, using the intel they had gathered during the attack. They moved under the cover of darkness, taking out key targets and setting up ambushes. Each time they struck, they made sure McCall's men couldn't recover. They crippled supply lines, disrupted communication, and dismantled McCall's power one piece at a time. But as the days wore on, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that McCall was growing desperate. His men were being whittled down, but they were still dangerous. They had the numbers, and they had the firepower. But what they didn't have was the will to fight like Pine Ridge did. Eleanor stood by the window of her home late one night, watching the moonlight spill across the town. Her thoughts were far from the peaceful world she had once known. This was her town, and she wasn't about to let anyone take it from her. Not McCall. Not anyone. The sudden crackle of her radio broke her concentration. She picked it up, her hand steady. "Eleanor," Jimmy's voice came through the speaker, sharp with urgency. "We've got a problem." "What's happened?" Eleanor asked, her heart skipping a beat. "We've got a small group of McCall's men holed up in the old gas station on the edge of town. We need to move in and take them out before they can alert the rest of the gang." Eleanor's mind raced, but her decision was quick. "We're not waiting. I'll meet you there in 15 minutes. Get the team ready." Jimmy didn't argue. He knew Eleanor wouldn't back down. As she prepared to leave, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It was one of the local veterans, an older man with graying hair and a weathered face. "You sure you want to go out there?" he asked, his voice soft but concerned. Eleanor looked up at him, her expression unshaken. "I'm not letting McCall's men take control of this town. We fight together, or we don't fight at all." The veteran nodded, the corners of his lips curling into a smile. "Then I'm with you." Eleanor didn't need any more reassurance. She knew that they were all in this together. The team was ready, and they had one chance to stop McCall's empire from taking root again. The drive to the gas station was quick. The darkness of the night wrapped around them, but they had the element of surprise on their side. As they arrived, the gas station looked deserted, but Eleanor knew better. McCall's men were good at hiding, good at making it look like they were outnumbered. But they weren't. Not anymore. The team split up, moving silently through the shadows toward the building. Jimmy gave the signal, and the first explosion went off, timed perfectly to catch McCall's men off guard. The building shook, and Eleanor's heart surged as the sound of gunfire erupted. They were in the thick of it now. The battle was fast, brutal, and loud. Eleanor and the team moved with deadly precision, clearing room by room, each corner bringing them closer to their goal. They had no time to waste. The gas station was the last outpost McCall's men had in Pine Ridge, and they weren't going to let it stand. By the time the last biker fell to the ground, McCall's hold on Pine Ridge was officially broken. The building was in ruins, the gas station a smoldering heap of rubble. Eleanor stood in the center of the wreckage, her hand gripping her revolver as she surveyed the damage. They had won the battle, but McCall was still out there, and he was far from finished. "We've done it," Jimmy said, stepping beside her, his eyes scanning the area. Eleanor nodded, her gaze unwavering. "This is just the beginning. We need to take the fight to McCall. He's not going to let us go that easily." The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were ready. The battle at the gas station had been a victory, but it was a hollow one. McCall's men had been scattered, and their operations were in disarray. But Eleanor knew this was far from over. The war for Pine Ridge wasn't just about taking out a few men. It was about breaking McCall's grip on the town, his empire, and making sure he never came back. They had destroyed his supply lines, ambushed his safe houses, and torn apart the vestiges of his power. But now, the real fight was about to begin. McCall wasn't just going to sit back and let his empire fall. He was going to retaliate, and when he did, he would come with everything he had. Eleanor stood at the edge of the town, looking out over the horizon as the sun began to set. It felt like everything had led to this moment, the moment when McCall would either break or rise up to crush them all. She had prepared the town for war. The resistance was stronger than ever. But Eleanor had a deep, unshakable feeling that McCall was going to do whatever it took to destroy Pine Ridge. "Mom," Jimmy said, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. He had been by her side throughout the entire fight, a pillar of strength and leadership. "I think it's time we hit McCall where it really hurts. We've kept him on his heels for days now. It's time to finish this." Eleanor nodded, turning to face him. "I know. We can't wait for him to come to us anymore. We go after him. We strike his base, make sure he knows we're not backing down." They had learned the location of McCall's main compound, an old, fortified warehouse on the outskirts of town. It had once been a place of business, but now it served as McCall's headquarters. His men were holed up there, regrouping and making plans. Eleanor knew that this would be their last chance to take McCall down for good. The team gathered in the old church once again. This time, the mood was different. The people of Pine Ridge were ready for the final push. The veterans, the farmers, the shopkeepers, everyone who had been brought together by Eleanor's call to action. They had fought with her, bled with her, and now they would fight to take back the town they all loved. Everyone knows what we're doing, Eleanor began, her voice strong, unwavering. We take the fight to McCall. We hit the compound hard, fast, and we don't stop until it's over. This town belongs to us, and McCall is going to learn that the hard way. Jimmy stood beside her, his expression determined. We've been on the offensive, but we need to hit his compound with everything we've got. If we do this right, McCall won't be able to recover. We take the fight to him. We hit fast, get in, get out, and leave him with nothing. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would split into teams and surround the compound, attacking from all angles. With the element of surprise on their side, they would overwhelm McCall's men before they could even react. It was their best shot at putting an end to this nightmare. As the final preparations were made, Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the people she had once known, her comrades from the war. She had seen enough of the world's darkness to know that this moment was just another chapter in a long history of battles. But there was something different about Pine Ridge. This town had been her sanctuary, and she wasn't about to let anyone, especially not McCall, take it from her. The night they decided to strike, the air was thick with anticipation. The town had quieted, the streets empty as the resistance moved into position. Eleanor, Jimmy, and their team gathered in the shadows, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. "This is it," Jimmy said, his voice steady as he glanced over at his mother. "Stay sharp, Mom. We'll be in and out before they know what hit them." Eleanor gave a nod, her heart steady, but her mind racing. "I'm ready." They moved quickly, weaving through the streets and into the surrounding forest. The compound was just a few miles away, hidden deep behind trees and a high chain-link fence. But they knew exactly where to strike. Jimmy had gotten intel from one of his old contacts, and they were ready to breach the perimeter. They reached the compound's outer edge, and Jimmy signaled for the team to get into position. The plan was simple. One team would take the front, while the other would approach from the side. Eleanor and Jimmy would lead the charge, and they would make sure that McCall's men couldn't escape. "On my count," Jimmy whispered, his voice calm but urgent. 3, 2, 1. The explosion was deafening. It rocked the compound, sending a shockwave through the ground as the front gate blew open. The team moved in, rifles raised, charging forward with the kind of precision they had practiced for weeks. The element of surprise was theirs, and McCall's men had no time to react. The fight was on. Eleanor and Jimmy led the charge, their boots pounding against the ground as they ran toward the building. The sounds of gunfire filled the air, but they didn't stop. They moved like a single force, taking out McCall's men one by one. Inside the compound, McCall's men scrambled, trying to mount a defense. But they were disorganized. They weren't expecting this. They weren't expecting the people they had underestimated to come at them with everything they had. Eleanor's eyes scanned the area as they moved through the compound, clearing each room with precision. The adrenaline surged through her, her body reacting to every sound, every movement. She had fought in much worse places against far deadlier enemies. But this was different. This was personal. "Jimmy," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "The warehouse. We need to find McCall." They reached the heart of the compound, the warehouse where McCall was most likely hiding. The doors were reinforced, but Jimmy had already anticipated this. With one quick motion, he planted explosives, and they blew the doors off their hinges. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the air heavy with tension. McCall was there. Eleanor could feel it. She could sense his presence, the man who had terrorized Pine Ridge for so long. But McCall wasn't waiting for them. He wasn't going to make it easy. Eleanor and Jimmy stepped inside, ready for whatever McCall had planned next. The warehouse was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant echo of gunfire as the rest of the team fought their way through the compound. But inside, it was a different kind of tension, a silence that was almost suffocating. Eleanor could feel her pulse quickening, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. This was the endgame. This was where McCall would either face justice or escape and continue his reign of terror. They moved through the darkened warehouse with careful, deliberate steps, their guns raised, eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. McCall was here somewhere. She could feel his presence, like a shadow looming over them. He wouldn't run. He never ran. He would stand and fight until the bitter end. "Mom," Jimmy whispered, his voice steady but urgent. "You stay behind me." Eleanor didn't argue. She trusted her son, but she had fought enough battles in her life to know that she wasn't going to let anyone shield her now. This was her fight just as much as it was his. They reached the far corner of the warehouse, where stacks of crates and boxes had been pushed aside to create a makeshift barricade. McCall's men had set up defenses here, preparing for the inevitable assault. But it wasn't going to matter. The resistance had already taken out most of McCall's crew, and now it was just the two of them, McCall and his last few loyal men. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and Eleanor's eyes narrowed. She knew McCall was close. They had him cornered. "You're making a mistake, Eleanor," a voice rang out, low and menacing. It was McCall's voice, filled with venom, and it came from behind the barricade. "You think you've won, but you've only delayed the inevitable. This town will never belong to you. It's mine." Eleanor and Jimmy froze for a moment, the familiar voice of the man who had terrorized them for so long sending a chill down their spines. McCall's arrogance was unmistakable, but Eleanor wasn't afraid. She was done with fear. It was time for McCall to face the consequences of his actions. "You're wrong, McCall," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "This town belongs to the people, and they've had enough of you." She stepped forward, her hand steady on the revolver. Jimmy moved with her, staying close, ready for whatever was about to come. From behind the barricade, McCall stepped into view, his hands raised in mock surrender. But his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were filled with malice. He was a large man, built like a tank, his face covered with tattoos and scars from a life of violence. But there was something else behind his eyes now, a flicker of doubt. He had been expecting to crush Pine Ridge, to make an example of the town. But now, facing Eleanor and Jimmy, he was starting to realize just how wrong he had been. "You think you've won, huh?" McCall sneered, his hand hovering near his side, where a gun was holstered. "You've taken down a few of my men. You've made a mess of my plans. But it's too late. You can't stop what's coming." "We already have," Eleanor replied, her voice calm but resolute. "Your empire is crumbling. You're not the king of this town anymore, McCall. It's over." McCall's eyes flashed with rage, and in a blur of motion, he reached for his gun. But Eleanor was faster. She raised her revolver in one smooth motion and fired, the shot echoing through the warehouse as McCall's gun flew from his hand, landing several feet away. He staggered back, a look of shock and disbelief on his face. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that his reign would never end. But now he was on the ground, his hands held up in surrender, the life he had built on fear and intimidation slipping through his fingers. "You don't get to terrorize this town anymore," Eleanor said, her voice unwavering. She took a step toward him, her revolver still raised. "This ends now." McCall glared up at her, his chest heaving with anger and disbelief. "You think you won? You think this is over? I've got men all over this town. You can't stop me. I will come back. You haven't seen the last of me." Eleanor's gaze softened for a moment, the weight of his words settling in. She knew McCall wasn't done. He would always be a threat, but he wasn't in control anymore. He wasn't the one calling the shots. "No, McCall," she said firmly. "You're done, and so is your empire." With that, she stepped back and nodded to Jimmy. The young man moved in, his military training evident as he took McCall into custody, quickly securing his arms behind his back and binding him with rope. "We're taking you to the authorities," Jimmy said, his voice sharp. You'll stand trial for the crimes you've committed." McCall growled in frustration, but said nothing, knowing he was beaten. His empire was gone, and he was no longer in control of anything. Eleanor looked around the warehouse, the last remnants of McCall's operations scattered around her. The fight had been long, but it was over. Pine Ridge was free. And this time, they weren't going to let anyone take it from them again. As they led McCall away, Eleanor and Jimmy shared a quiet moment. They had won. The town of Pine Ridge was free from the grasp of McCall and his criminal empire. It hadn't been easy, but they had done it together. The people of Pine Ridge had fought for their future, and they had succeeded. Eleanor looked over at her son, her heart swelling with pride. He had grown into a man who would stand by her no matter what. And together, they had brought McCall down. "We did it," Jimmy said, his voice filled with both relief and exhaustion. Eleanor nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "We did. And Pine Ridge is ours once again." The weeks following McCall's capture were filled with a quiet kind of relief that settled over Pine Ridge like a blanket. The people who had once lived in fear now walked the streets with their heads held high, their hearts lighter than they had been in years. The reign of terror McCall had inflicted upon them was over, and while the scars were deep, there was hope. Pine Ridge was free. But freedom, as Eleanor knew all too well, came at a cost. There was much work to be done. McCall's empire may have been shattered, but his influence had spread far, and the town would need to rebuild, not just from the physical damage, but from the mental and emotional toll that his terror had exacted. Eleanor and Jimmy moved swiftly to help the town heal. With McCall behind bars and his men scattered, the team began working to restore order, to help the locals reclaim their lives, their businesses, and their homes. The first priority was the local businesses, many of which had been extorted by McCall and his gang. Eleanor helped meet with the business owners, offering them the strength and encouragement to move forward. The farm owners, who had once feared their crops being burned or stolen, now had a renewed sense of purpose. With McCall out of the picture, they could once again take pride in their land. While Jimmy coordinated with the local law enforcement, organizing patrols, and making sure that McCall's few remaining loyalists were hunted down, Eleanor worked tirelessly with the townspeople. They repaired homes, rebuilt roads, and made the town's infrastructure stronger than it had ever been before. Every corner of Pine Ridge began to glow with newfound hope. And yet, Eleanor couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. The quiet whispers of what McCall had left behind, corruption, fear, and loss, lingered in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't quite gone out. Pine Ridge was free, yes, but it had been irrevocably changed. It would take time to undo the damage McCall's empire had caused. One afternoon, as Eleanor sat at the small table in her kitchen, she looked out over the town she had fought so hard to protect. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the land. Jimmy had gone out with the team, making sure the remaining pockets of McCall's men were cleaned up. It was strange how quickly the town had shifted from a battleground to something more peaceful. But that peace felt fragile, like glass that could shatter at any moment. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know why, but she felt a strange tension in her chest as she made her way to the door. When she opened it, she was met by a familiar face, one she hadn't seen in years. "Ruth," Eleanor said, her voice full of surprise. Ruth, a longtime friend from Eleanor's days in Pine Ridge, stood on the doorstep, her face weathered by time but still sharp and kind. She had been a staple of the community, always helping when things got tough. But Ruth hadn't been around much since McCall's rise to power. She had kept her distance, not wanting to risk becoming a target. "I thought I'd find you here," Ruth said with a warm but knowing smile. "You've done it, Eleanor. You've given us our town back." Eleanor stepped aside to let Ruth in, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. "It hasn't been easy, but we're getting there. McCall's empire is broken, and Pine Ridge will be stronger for it." It's just going to take time." "I know," Ruth replied, sitting at the table across from Eleanor. "But don't you think it's time to let the people of Pine Ridge have something more than just rebuilding? They need hope, real hope. They need something to unite them, to remind them of what they're fighting for." Eleanor sat down across from Ruth, a somber expression on her face. "You're right, Ruth. But what more is there? We've fought for this town. We've made sure McCall's gone. We've rebuilt what he took from us." Ruth nodded, her eyes sharp with understanding. "That's the problem, Eleanor. You've rebuilt the town, yes. But you need to rebuild something else, something that was lost along the way. The heart of this town. The reason why Pine Ridge exists in the first place." Eleanor furrowed her brow, not quite understanding. "What do you mean?" "McCall may have taken the town's freedom," Ruth said, leaning forward. "But he also took its soul. People were afraid to live here. They were afraid to stand up. They needed someone to lead them, to show them that they weren't powerless anymore. You've done that. You've shown them that they're not weak, that they're stronger than they know." Eleanor blinked, taking in Ruth's words. She hadn't realized it, but Ruth was right. The town hadn't just been under McCall's thumb physically. It had been psychologically shackled as well. People were afraid to live, to dream. They had become accustomed to McCall's rule, his constant threat hanging over their heads. And now that it was over, Eleanor had done something she hadn't considered. She had reignited something deep inside Pine Ridge. Hope. Eleanor sighed, looking out the window again. "We've lost so much. So many lives, so many homes." Ruth reached out and took her hand. "You've given them back something that's more important than any building. You've given them back their spirit, Eleanor. The town isn't just standing again, it's alive. You've already done more than anyone could have asked of you." Eleanor sat back in her chair, letting Ruth's words sink in. It wasn't just about rebuilding what McCall had destroyed. It was about reminding Pine Ridge of what it had always been. A community, a family. And it was a family that was stronger than any empire. Later that day, Eleanor stood before a crowd of townspeople in the center of Pine Ridge. It had become a town meeting of sorts, a gathering of all the faces that had worked together, fought together, and lost together. They had rebuilt their homes, their businesses, and now it was time to rebuild the spirit of Pine Ridge. Standing at the front, Eleanor addressed the crowd, her voice full of pride and strength. "You've all shown what it means to fight for each other, to fight for what's ours. Pine Ridge isn't just a town, it's a home, and together we've taken it back. We've taken back our lives, our dignity, and our future." The crowd erupted in applause, the cheers ringing through the streets. They weren't just celebrating their survival. They were celebrating their victory, their hope for a future that was theirs to build. Eleanor's eyes scanned the crowd, her heart swelling with pride. She had done it. They had done it. Pine Ridge was more than a town. It was a testament to the power of resilience and unity. And with that, she knew one thing for certain. No matter what came next, Pine Ridge would always stand strong. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.